Sheriff, y'all may be seated. Call your name.
This time in our state calls Mr. Jonathan Priest.
Sir, if you would please come to the front of the court. Swear you in front of you. Good, please raise your right hand. I swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth.
I do.
Please have a seat. Respond to any questions posed to you. Perhaps after that, Ms. Matson or Mr. Harris. You may proceed whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Mr. Priest. Would you please introduce yourself to the jury?
Certainly. My name is Jonathan Priest. That's JONATHYPRIEST.
And Mr. Priest, what do you currently do for a living?
I'm a forensic analyst and educator for Bevel Gardner and Associates. Basically what that means is I look at cases, I analyze cases, and I instruct others in both criminal justice field, law enforcement attorneys, and colleges in the area of forensic analysis.
And Mr. Priest, prior to your current position, what was your previous career?
I was a police officer for the city and county of Denver in Colorado. I was there 32 years. Spent time as a patrol officer, as a detective, as a sergeant, and as the commander at lieutenant rank for the major crime section.
And Mr. Priest, have you had an opportunity to investigate officer-involved shootings?
Many.
And please tell the jury about your background and experience in investigating officer-involved shootings.
When I was working for the Denver Police Department, I began working in the homicide unit in the late 1980s. As a detective in the homicide unit, one of our responsibilities, in addition to death investigation, is the investigation of officer-involved shootings. I was promoted to sergeant and again was assigned to the homicide unit, where we continued not only death investigations, but the investigation of officer-involved shooting. But as a supervisor, I had greater roles in the involvement in interviewing involved officers and witness officers, as well as policy creation in the area of officer-involved shooting investigations, both criminally and administratively. I was then promoted to lieutenant, where I became the commander of the major crime section, which included the homicide unit, among other criminal investigative units, and at that point became greatly involved in officer-involved shooting investigations, policy creation, and instruction in those areas.
And Mr. Priest, how many officer-involved shooting investigations have you conducted as a lead investigator?
Hundreds. Hundreds. Where an officer discharged their firearm, hundreds.
And so I guess it's fair to say too many to count?
Yes.
And Mr. Priest, would you please tell the jury what exactly is an officer-involved in shooting investigation?
Officer-involved shooting investigations predominantly relate to those incidents where a police officer discharges their firearm or a police officer is shot. Those typically are the cases that are related to anything that is classified as an officer-involved shooting.
And Mr. Priest, do you hold any special certificates or training when it comes to the field of officer-involved in shooting investigations?
Well, certainly I have a background in crime scene investigation, both hundreds of hours of instruction, plus I teach in those areas of crime scene investigation, which relate directly to officer-involved shooting investigations. I have a background through the International Association of Identification in certain areas of analysis that may become relevant in officer-involved shooting cases. I also hold a certificate with the Force Science Institute, which deals specifically with dynamics related to officer-involved shootings.
And Mr. Priest, have you had an opportunity to testify as an expert when it comes to officer-involved shooting investigations?
Many times.
And have you in fact testified within the state of Texas?
I have.
In Dallas County?
Yes.
In this very courthouse?
Yes.
Have you had the opportunity to testify in other states?
Yes.
In federal cases?
I have.
And Mr. Priest, certainly you are hired, is that correct?
I am.
And what is your hourly rate?
My hourly rate is $175 an hour. That said, in full disclosure, my company charges $295 an hour. My rate is $175.
And do you have an estimate of how much you anticipate the final bill will be for your work involving this criminal prosecution?
And I certainly don't have a total amount. I would say, given the amount of material that I've reviewed in this, I'm probably looking at 30+ hours total.
And Mr. Priest, have you had an opportunity to review cases on behalf of the state before?
I have.
And have you reviewed cases on behalf of the defense before?
I have.
And what would you say, or do you have an estimate of what percentage of your work is spent working for the state and defense or any other agencies?
In criminal cases, I'm roughly about 60% of the time prosecution, 40% of the time defense. In civil cases, I'm probably half and half.
Now, Mr. Priest, when we asked you to take a look at this case, what exactly did we ask you to do?
It asked me to look at the case and determine, do a reasonableness inquiry.
Did we tell you any sort of opinions that we had regarding the defendant's use of force in this case?
No.
What information were you provided?
The entire case file. I looked at photographs, body-worn camera video, several documents related to training, agency policy and procedures, crime scene investigation information, and I got over probably 10,000 pages of documents, minutes of video and audio, photographs. I'd have to look at the entire list to determine exactly everything, but predominantly the investigative file.
Okay, and so would you say, would it be a lot of material or very little material that you received?
It was a lot of material.
And Mr. Priest, did we in fact ask you to review this case and to render an opinion as to the defendant's use of force?
Yes.
And were you able to do that based on all the information that you've received?
I was.
And Mr. Priest, would you please share for the jury what exactly was your opinion?
My opinion in this case is that the use of force in this particular incident was unreasonable.
And Mr. Priest, what exactly do you, what formed the basis of that opinion? Would you please share that with the jury?
Two things major were the statutes of the state of Texas, predominantly Section 9, and the policies and general orders of the Dallas Police Department.
And when you say Section 9, you're talking about Chapter 9 of the Penal Code?
Correct.
And you stated the policies of the Dallas Police Department.
Yes.
Mr. Priest, why would the policies of an agency, or in your opinion, why does an agency have policies related to rules for their officers to follow?
Policies predominantly mirror what statutes say. It also is consistent with training protocols that the officers receive. So they're the policies, general orders, procedures, agencies call them different things, but they all pretty much mean the same thing, are the guidelines that officers follow when basically involved in any given particular incident. They call them general orders or procedures, mainly because they're not looking for something specific per se, but they're giving general guides for officers to follow when they're involved in any given incident.
And you stated that you, when rendering your opinion in this case, that you did make note of certain general orders and policies of the Dallas Police Department.
I did.
What specifically was of interest to you?
Predominantly the use of force general orders. I believe, coincidentally, that was also the 900 series.
And would that be Dallas Police Department General Order number 906?
Yes.
And in particular, 906.02, which is the use of deadly force policy.
Correct.
Now, let's go back to the beginning. When you look at a case before you render your opinion, do you start at what information was available to the officer?
Typically, when I analyze a case, I begin where the case began. I want to start with the crime scene. So I'm going to look at what was available to the officers at the scene, what information exists to put me into a position where I can make an inquiry into basically what the officer experienced.
And based upon your review on this case, what did you gather that this defendant knew either arriving to the scene or as the scene unfolded?
This case began as a suspicious vehicle. During the initial response to the scene, further information was developed, depending on what information existed, but that there were occupants in the vehicle, that the occupants were a male and female, that the occupants had been at that location previous, that the vehicle was listed as stolen. All of these things are available to the officers as they're approaching and would typically create a response for the officers and a process in how they will respond to that particular incident.
And based on the materials you reviewed and your understanding of the way that the Dallas Police Department trains its officers, did you make any note or consideration as the defendant's approach to the vehicle in question?
I did.
And please share that with the jury.
When the officers first arrived at the scene, their approach was certainly tactically sound. They maintained a position of cover, maintained a visual on the vehicle, allowed other officers to arrive, had some level of communication amongst each other as they're making a decision on what the ultimate approach might look like. Began to attempt contact with the individuals in the car, trying to make contact with them to get a response from the individuals in the car. There was discussion about, was anybody actually in the car? And what should next steps be?
And you've had an opportunity, you sat throughout this entire trial and you were able to listen to all the testimony that's come forth today. But taking that into consideration, what do you make of the defense's decision to pull the squad car closer to Ms. Dawes' vehicle?
From a tactical standpoint, by moving forward, it reduced the amount of distance between the officers, and it also created a greater risk to the officers, simply in the fact that from their initial position where they were in a much better position to respond and develop additional options should that need arise.
And Mr. Priest, what does the expression closing the gap mean when it comes to law enforcement?
Closing the gap basically means getting closer, taking that distance cushion away and getting closer to them. There are situations where closing the gap can be advantageous. There are other situations where gaining distance is much more advantageous and less risky.
And what are the concepts of time, cover, and distance, and why are they important to police officers?
Time gives you time to assess, time to evaluate, time to discuss options, time to allow additional officers to respond should that be the particular setting that would need to occur. Time for additional lighting, say that's near dawn or something, or near dusk if darkness would be more advantageous. Distance gives you options. Distance gives you ability to not only assess with the time that you have created for yourself, but gives you time to react. Reaction time takes time, and distance allows for more options available to the officer. Tactics certainly relate directly to, okay, should I have more time? Should I have greater distance? What options are available to me and how can I react given this particular situation?
Now, Mr. Priest, as we're walking through the encounter that had happened on January 18th, 2017, what next did you make of, what did you notice next of importance?
Well, after the vehicle was moved closer to the subject vehicle, officers moved closer, reducing their distance and their ability to respond. Two of the officers actually moved into a position where they were relatively directly behind the car, in a position where they don't really have any cover at all. And it was just kind of an interesting observation in that while everybody is moving behind the vehicle, based on the information, the purpose of moving the car up was to provide close cover. Two of the officers didn't even use the close cover.
And is it your understanding of the policy of the Dallas Police Department when it comes to moving vehicles, are officers authorized to use deadly force in those situations?
In a moving vehicle?
Yes.
No.
And what is the danger of using deadly force in a moving vehicle?
Well, a vehicle is a machine. The machine is operated by an individual. If fire is delivered to that machine and it takes out the individual operating that machine, the machine can become more dangerous than it initially was, because now there's nobody operating it. It's just an unoperated machine. So that's one problem. A second problem is that we don't know who's in that vehicle. And certainly the person operating the machine doesn't necessarily speak for or represent any other individual that might be in that vehicle. So they are placing not only themselves in danger, but others who may be in the vehicle in danger. Additionally, who's around the vehicle, whether seen or unseen. Shooting at any moving target is difficult. Even through training, it's difficult. And the danger in causing unexpected or unwanted collateral damage is raised by the fact that you are now engaging with deadly force, something that is in motion.
And Mr. Priest, what next did you notice in the incident that occurred?
The vehicle began to move. And as it moves, the police car is then moved forward in, for all intents and purposes, a barricade setting being used to block the car in. And the subject vehicle backed into the police car. There was contact. Officers see this car moving and, consistent with agency policy, began to move to better positions of cover, or certainly out of the way of the direct path of the vehicle. The vehicle then moved forward towards the fence. It made contact with the fence. There was an audible noise of contact. Officers continued to move to different positions. The vehicle then reversed a second time. The front steer wheels of the vehicle turned to allow it to miss the police vehicle, which was obviously parked behind it, and began to move in a straight line along the front of the police vehicle. It was at that point that shots were heard.
And Mr. Priest, can you explain to the jury, based on not only the Dallas Police Department's policy, but best practices for law enforcement, how are officers trained of things that they should look out for when they actually use their firearm?
Well, there's 4 rules of firearm safety that are trained with not only law enforcement, but people who take shooting classes in general. And the first rule is that all firearms are always loaded. The second rule is that keep your trigger or keep your finger off the trigger until you're on target and ready to fire. Don't let the muzzle of your firearm cross or point at anything that you're not willing to destroy. And lastly, be aware of your target and what lies beyond. Anyone who is discharging a firearm needs to be aware of those 4 rules. Officers not only are taught that routinely, but many training academies have them posted in many locations, both at the training facility and around law enforcement agencies.
And based upon the Dallas Police Department's policy as well as best practices for law enforcement, did the defendant's action in firing his firearm follow that training?
Certainly the officer was aware of trigger control. All fire was directed at the target that he had identified. There was no information that I had from a review that he was unaware that his firearm was loaded. He obviously allowed his muzzle to cross a target. The big thing was aware of the target and what lied beyond. I found nothing in the material that I reviewed that any officer was aware of what lied beyond their target.
And with any of the material reviewed, were you aware of any officer actually knowing who was inside that vehicle?
No.
What they were shooting at inside the vehicle?
No.
Does the Dallas Police Department train its officers to shoot blindly at vehicles?
No.
What would have been the actual target?
Well, based on the information that I reviewed, the driver of the vehicle was the target. But again, that information was not determined to a level of completeness. I found nothing in the material that I reviewed to where questions were asked of anyone to support exactly what the point of aim was.
Were the officers able to identify or see who was inside of that car prior to shots being fired?
No.
And in your review of the material, it wasn't in fact that at the moment that the defendant shot out the passenger window that they were able to see inside the car?
Well, even then, once the window is broken, we're pretty much towards the end of the incident. But even then, identifying specific individuals or an individual inside that vehicle was certainly not determined based on the materials that I reviewed.
Mr. Priest, at this time, I want to show you what's been entered into evidence as State's Exhibit number 140.
North Washington, black male refused to stay away from property.
Silence! Now! Silence!
In a big pig.
Watch out. Back up.
Have you ever ran the like security with a uniform and armed?
Don't move!
Okay, and we paused the video right as the first shot is being fired, but if we go directly just before that moment, Mr. Priest, are there any officers that are standing behind that Dodge Journey?
At the moment shots are fired?
Before the moment that shots are even fired?
Oh, well, depends on how far before the moment. I mean, obviously there are officers behind the vehicle, but when we get into a position or the vehicle gets into a position where shots are fired, no officers are back there.
All right, and we're going to start it again.
Pig.
Watch out. Back up.
Have you ever ran the like security with
And so at this point in time, as before the vehicle even backs up and before the defendant fires shots, there are no officers that are standing behind that Dodge Journey. Would you agree with that?
That's fair, I'd agree.
a the informant armed.
Don't move! Hands up! Shots fired!
So we have 2 volleys of shots in this incident. How do you characterize the second volley?
The only thing that I can assess just by looking at that information is the second volley was shot simply because the car was rolling. There was no assessment of the information that I saw that there was a reanalysis by shooting officers of any danger to anyone at that point.
And are officers trained to reassess situations if situations can change over time? Are they taught to kind of pause and reassess what's going on?
Now, reassessing is a big part of discharging a firearm, being aware of your target, what lies beyond.
Are officers trained to shoot at vehicles just because they're continuing to move?
Officers are not trained to shoot at vehicles at all in typical situations.
Are officers trained to shoot when it comes to deadly force just because someone disobeyed a verbal command?
No.
Are officers trained to shoot if there has been no specific, articulation of deadly force being used by the individual that they're shooting at?
No.
Based on your assessment of this case, was the vehicle moving in reverse a threat to any of those officers of deadly force immediate at that point in time?
At the moment shots were fired, there was no immediate need to use deadly force.
Mr. Priest, I believe that you were also in court last week and we heard from one of the defense experts, and he talked a lot about how officers are trained, but that under certain situations that they're human and they just can't comport with that training. What do you make of that characterization or that line of testimony from the defense expert?
Well, it's inconsistent with training. It's certainly inconsistent with my experience.
Why do officers train?
Officer training is basically designed to improve a response to any given situation. Many of us experience that the first time we ever drove a car. We would probably admit that the first time we drive a car, we're not as good as we may be after several years of driving a car, or doing anything for that matter. Painting or even sweeping a broom, using something, you get better as you begin to learn how the thing actually works. Stressful situations, however, incorporate a number of other things that come into play. And training is designed to reduce reduce not only your trait anxiety, but your state anxiety. I probably should explain that.
What is the difference between state and anxiety?
Okay, trait anxiety is the anxiety that any given individual has routinely. Different things may affect you differently than others. There are people who are afraid of spiders. There are people who are afraid of snakes. There are people who are afraid of any number of things, loud noises, quiet, dark, light. Any number of things come into play, and that's trait anxiety, and those things stress you. State anxiety is the anxiety that you experience at a given moment. You're driving down the road, and in Texas, when rain freezes on the road, you may lose control of that car. And that can create state anxiety. And depending on your skill level, your training, your background, your experience, how you respond to that can differ. However, training in stressful situations can reduce certainly state anxiety, that you're able to respond better to a given incident because of that training, and it can also have an impact on, because of repetition, your trait anxiety. You're able to control it better. even though you may still be afraid of spiders, you have an ability to deal with it because you recognize that I know I'm afraid of it, but I have to deal with it, so I do, and that can be trained.
And Mr. Priest, in your review of the materials, has the defendant received many hours of training?
I believe the material that I reviewed over 1,000.
Over 1,000.
Yes.
And is the defendant, would you classify him as a rookie officer, or he had been on the force for at least a number of years?
The material that I reviewed supported that the individual had been on the aid to the department for over 10 years. Over 1,000 hours worth of training, that's significant. That's a lot of training.
And Mr. Priest, based on your review of this case, did you find any connection between the gun that was later found inside of the Dodge Journey and the defendant's decision to use deadly force?
No.
So no connection between the two at all?
None.
Mr. Priest, what is tunnel vision?
Tunnel vision is hyperfocus. Our eyes have the ability to see certain things. We have both our focal vision, and that's what we're paying attention to, and we have our peripheral vision. The human eye, a single eye, has the ability to have about 130 to 134 degrees of peripheral vision. But our focal vision is pretty finite. It's very distinct, and that's only about 2 to 4 degrees. If you were to take your thumb and put it out in front of your face and stare at your thumb, that's about the width of our focal length. And everything else around it gets a little out of focus. In stressful situations, what happens with the body, because it's interested in preservation, we go into a response, typically a sympathetic response, typically known as fight, flight, or freeze. Any stressful situation, we may experience that. And when that occurs, our hyper-focus starts to really pay attention to what we may identify as a threat or identify as a concern. We really begin to hyper-focus on that, and that peripheral vision really starts to take a back seat. And it's not like it disappears and becomes this dark tunnel, but it's not something that our mind is capturing and remembering. That's basically tunnel vision.
And specifically, as applied to this case, do you have an example that you can give the jury of how tunnel vision could come into play with regard to the Dodge Journey moving?
Well, certainly, and with respect to how tunnel vision can be trained out,
yes,
certainly. If you were to take, for example, say a football game, you look at the quarterback, who obviously and arguably is in a stressful situation. Why? Well, there's stress to succeed. There's stress to make sure that you do, in a passing situation, stress to get the ball where you need it to go. You need to be paying attention not only to getting the ball downfield and to the target that you're getting it to, but you also have to be aware that there are several individuals that are going to try to get to you and stop you, and you need to be aware of them. So training comes into play to where as they're moving at you, I'm paying attention to them so I can move if I need to. I can reduce the risk of losing the ball to those individuals, still maintaining my focus on the individual that I want to get the ball to. All of these things are training situations where I can improve my response given my background and training and the level of stress that is actually being applied to me.
And as a police officer, for police officers, does tunnel vision cause you to lose focus of the target or your background or what else may be lying beyond the field of where that officer is firing?
Depending on the level of training of the particular individual and depending on the circumstances, certainly tunnel vision has an effect. It is certainly something that can come into play. But again, one of the reasons that we try to reduce tunnel vision, or one of the ways that we try to reduce tunnel vision, is through that training. Because we recognize that it is a factor. And through additional training, through providing examples or experience to officers in non-stressful situations, it helps them reduce that particular tunnel vision setting. Your background in vision doesn't actually go away. Your ability to report it might, depending on how much of an effect it has on that particular individual.
And in this particular case, with review of the material, do you recall in the body-worn cams where the defendant is telling other officers to get back, get back?
Oh, definitely.
And then does tunnel vision, I guess, is it kind of like a trance where an officer just forgets about everything else that's around them?
From a memory standpoint, people have an inability to report what they don't perceive, meaning that you can't talk about things that you just don't encode. You don't perceive it, so you can't talk about it. That's part of tunnel vision. To completely ignore those things, depending on your level of training and background and prior experience, it becomes less likely for the individual trained in certain circumstances to have the same effects as somebody that doesn't have the same background and training.
Mr. Priest, what is a sympathetic fire?
Sympathetic fire, the nervous system, you have two different areas of concern. One is the somatic system. Somatic system is the voluntary system. I can pick this pen up, I can scratch my cheek, I can run my hand through my hair. These are all voluntary responses. The sympathetic system is a subset of the autonomic system, which means things are done unconsciously or unintentionally. And that breaks down into two different areas, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The parasympathetic system is that maintains homeostasis. It reduces our heart rate and blood pressure, it improves and increases digestion, it creates a relaxing atmosphere. And sympathetic, and we've talked a little about this already, is that fight, flight, or freeze response to where a number of things can occur. Sympathetic fire or the sympathetic reactions can be a reaction to stress. We often see it if you've ever watched a scary movie and something scary occurs and you startle and you jump. That is a sympathetic response. There's no actual threat to you, but your body can't differentiate. Your body can't differentiate between something real and something perceived. So the fact that you're actually being threatened, the body doesn't know. All it does is perceive, the body just sees that and reacts to it. So that's that sympathetic response. And in sympathetic response, a number of things can occur. You can just tighten up, that's freeze, okay, where you're just tightening up like this. You can jump, you can fall down, you can scream. A number of different things can occur in those areas as well from sympathetic response. And it's just a reaction that the body has, and it's a non-voluntary or autonomic response.
So a simple way for you of phrasing it is kind of like you just reacted to whatever it was, maybe something startling occurred, and you just reacted.
Sure.
Did you have any opinions when reviewing this case regarding Officer Kimball's firing his firearm?
I did.
Please share that with the jury.
Off.
Officer Kimball has testified why he fired the firearm. He is the best position to tell this jury that. This expert has no reason to have an expert opinion on what Officer Kimball was thinking when he's already told the jury.
And Judge, if I may, may, and this witness certainly isn't going to state to what was in Officer Kimball's mind, but furthermore, this witness is going to state that as part of his consideration for his ultimate opinion, he did take into account the fact that Officer Kimball did fire his firearm as well.
Objection.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Priest, I believe you were getting ready to share with the jury what were your opinion that you had regarding Officer Kimball firing his firearm.
Officer Kimball fired a single round. Law enforcement routinely and nationally doesn't typically train officers to fire a single round. Most training regiment goes through firing twice, firing 3 times, reload drills, firing additional times, but from a training standpoint, firing a single round is unusual. Based on my experience, based on the investigations that I have conducted over hundreds of officer-involved shooting situations, when an officer discharges a single round, that typically speaks to sympathetic fire rather than intentional fire.
I'll ask the witness.
Cross-examination.
You never interviewed Officer Kimball, did you?
No,
You never asked him, did you?
no,
You never talked to him, did you?
no.
You didn't check your findings, did you?
I'm sorry, say that again?
You didn't check this opinion with the actual source before you decided you're an expert in front of this jury. You didn't even talk to him, did you?
I did not talk to Officer Kimball, no.
You just decided that you know better than every officer out there without interviewing a single one, correct?
No, I never said anything about knowing better. I'm simply speaking to my experience in investigating hundreds of these types of cases.
Without interviewing a single witness.
That's true.
Anything further?
Nothing further for this witness, Your Honor.
Sir, you may excuse me further service unless there's an objection.
No objection from the state.
Yes, ma'am. Very good. Call your next witness, please.
Your Honor, there's no jury to say first.
It's customary in our law and our procedure to take a break at this time, so if you would please go with the sheriff to wait further instructions. All rise for the jurors. Thank you, Sheriff. Y'all may be seated. I want to give you an opportunity to dig out before we call the jurors back. I don't know if you call the client, if you need to review the admonitions, however you want to proceed. And that includes taking a break to the state.
I'll just need a short break. I think we made our decision.
Course and recess.